Hi, it's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives for families of critically ill patients in intensive care so that you can make informed decisions, have peace of mind, real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. In the last blog I talked about 5 things the intensive care team hasn't told you when your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. You can check out last week's blog by clicking on the link below this video. In this week's blog I want to talk about how to stay positive when your critically ill loved one is on the ventilator with tracheostomy for many weeks. Before I get into today's topic, I want to share a quote with you that I wrote on today's topic, and the quote says, "Mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy in intensive care can be one of the most frustrating experiences for critically ill patients and their families." If the critical illness of your loved one hasn't already been testing your and your family's patience, your stamina, your resilience, your faith, and your belief system to the max, many weeks of mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy will be testing you and your family even more. If you have found yourself and your critically ill loved one in this once-in-a-lifetime situation that you know you can't afford to be getting wrong, you are probably already wondering what's next and how long this ordeal will last for your critically ill loved one. Most families of critically ill patients and their families in intensive care who have a loved one on mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy for many weeks and sometimes many months don't know what to do. They don't know what questions to ask. They are often impatient. They don't look at the bigger picture, and they don't know how to stay positive when faced with this massive challenge where the odds seem to be stacked against you. Therefore, it's crucial that you and your family do your own research, put things in perspective, start asking the right questions, question the intensive care team, and rally all of your resources to stay positive and help your critically ill loved one to get through this massive challenge. So, let's get into today's topic. Mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy for many weeks and sometimes many months in intensive care is one of the most frustrating and also one of the most researched topics here at IntensiveCareHotline.com. Many of my clients and also many of our visitors to our website want to know more about this topic, because by the time they're starting to do their own research and by the time they're looking for help, they are usually at their wits' end. So therefore today I really want to focus on how I can give you perspective and on how I can help you to stay positive whilst facing the odds and while your critically ill loved one is facing this ordeal. Mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy usually starts out with ventilation with a breathing tube or an endotracheal tube in the mouth. If your loved one can't be weaned off the ventilator, they then get a tracheostomy inserted. Getting a tracheostomy in intensive care in the first place is usually a result of your loved one being in one of the following situations. Your loved one may either be very unstable and in a very critical condition, or they may be in a life-threatening situation, or they may not be waking up after an induced coma, or they may be in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, or they may be having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury. Other challenges that could be a result of having your loved one being ventilated with tracheostomy for many weeks or even many months are that your loved one might be also threatened with an NFR, not for resuscitation, or DNR, do not resuscitate order, or your loved one may be in a situation where the intensive care team suggests a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment as being quote-unquote in the best interest for your critically ill loved one, or your critically ill loved one may be approaching their end of life in intensive care. The fact of the matter is that the stakes are extremely high for you, for your family, and also for the intensive care team when your loved one is critically ill in intensive care and requires mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy. Staying positive when you are faced with this massive challenge when your loved one requires mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy for many weeks and many months in intensive care is what can often make all the difference between getting your critically ill loved one out of intensive care alive or not. This is in fact easier said than done. However, given that I have worked in intensive care for more than 15 years in 3 different countries, where I literally worked with thousands of critically ill patients and their families, and where I have also worked as a nurse unit manager for more than 5 years, I have seen and looked after many long-term ventilated patients with tracheostomies staying in intensive care for many weeks or even months, and in some rare cases even years. I have also counseled and consulted many families in intensive care who have or had a loved one in intensive care on a ventilator with tracheostomy for many weeks and many months. I also have experience in looking after ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies in their own home as a genuine alternative to a long-term stay in intensive care. And I get it. If you and your family watch your critically ill loved one suffer on mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy in intensive care, and many weeks or even many months have gone by, I know how difficult it is to stay positive. I know how you feel when you see no progress, when you see your loved one taking one step forward and then one step back. I know how you feel when you see your loved one getting depressed and lethargic because of the sterile ICU and hospital environment. And I know how you feel when you and your family spend day and night in intensive care, putting your life on hold to be with your loved one. It's a very, very difficult situation to be in, no question. And on top of all of that frustration, and on top of that, all of the frustrations because you can't see much progress, you are probably also thinking about the future and about the possibilities if your loved one can't be weaned off the ventilator. As I said before, besides facing a real end-of-life situation, this is probably the next biggest challenge for families in intensive care. Especially when your loved one is making no or little progress in getting weaned off the ventilator and or the tracheostomy, you feel like throwing in the towel and you feel like there's no hope. I know you might have seen numerous attempts failing to get your loved one off the ventilator, or you might have seen your loved one catching another infection or sepsis, setting them back for weeks. And on top of all of those challenges, you probably have a negative intensive care team who may or may not be prepared to invest all of the emotional, financial, equipment and staffing resources needed to get your critically ill loved one out of intensive care alive. You see, one of the biggest problems in intensive care is that at some point your critically ill loved one might have reached the 3-month mark in ICU, where they are still on a ventilator with tracheostomy and they're making no progress. By now you might have the intensive care team talking about a DNR, which stands for Do Not Resuscitate, or NFR, which stands for Not for Resuscitation order, or even worse, they may be talking about a withdrawal or a limitation of treatment as being quote-unquote in the best interest for your critically ill loved one, because they think your critically ill loved one will have no quality of life. that's often pretty bleak, and it offers little or no hope. And if you are finding yourself in a situation like this, you need to very quickly get some perspective in order to get the best outcomes that you and your family want and deserve for your critically ill loved one. First of all, you need to understand how an intensive care unit operates and how intensive care teams think, and also how they often use their perceived power and their perceived authority to get what they want. And if you are, like 99% of the families of critically ill patients in intensive care, you will buy into the perceived power and the perceived authority of the intensive care team, and you will make no informed decisions. You will get no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. Given that you are watching this right now, there is a very good chance that you have already realized that what 99% of the families of critically ill patients in intensive care are doing is not working. And I really want to give you some perspective here, and let's get on your way to staying positive. First, weaning your critically ill loved one off mechanical ventilation with tracheostomy can take time, but it's possible. Next, even if weaning off the ventilator and the tracheostomy fails, you need to know that a genuine alternative to long-term stay in intensive care exists with intensive care at home services. Find out more information by clicking on the link of the intensive care at home website. When you scroll down below this video in the written version of this blog, there is a link to the intensive care at home website. Next, intensive care at home can also wean your critically ill loved one off the ventilator at home. Even after many weeks in ICU or long-term acute care, your loved one can come off the ventilator and the tracheostomy. Sometimes a weaning off the ventilator is possible, but not a weaning off the tracheostomy. Also, quality of life with mechanical ventilation and a tracheostomy is possible at home with services like intensive care at home, and you'll be surprised how good of a quality of life mechanically ventilated patients with a tracheostomy can live at home. Next, intensive care units and intensive care teams often have limited insights about what's possible, and therefore it's a lot easier for them to suggest that a DNR, a do not resuscitate, or an NFR, a not for resuscitation order, a withdrawal of treatment, or a limitation of treatment might be quote-unquote in the best interest for your critically ill loved one, without genuinely looking for genuine alternatives like intensive care at home. Intensive care teams often think that quality of life isn't possible at home when ventilated with tracheostomy, and therefore they have a subjective view about quality of life without really knowing what it really means and what's possible in a home care environment. Quality of life, and in some instances quality of end of life, are highly sensitive subjects, and only you, your family, and your critically ill loved one should know what it means for you and your family. Don't let the intensive care team dictate what the quality of life should look like outside of intensive care, because they don't know. Next, intensive care units often have way bigger and almost always hidden agendas that go way beyond your critically ill loved one's diagnosis, prognosis, care and treatment. Therefore, whatever the intensive care team is telling you needs to be taken with a grain of salt and needs to be put in context around their hidden agenda and what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care. Next, you and your family need to educate yourself around putting things in perspective, standing your ground, staying positive, challenging the intensive care team and their assumptions, and therefore getting the best outcomes for your critically ill loved one. Even if your critically ill loved one is inevitably approaching their end of life when mechanically ventilated with tracheostomy in intensive care, you might want to consider things like quality of end-of-life services at home rather than your loved one approaching their end of life in intensive care. Again, intensive care at home can make this possible. Also, you and your family also need to find out what you can do to get your loved one off the ventilator if the intensive care team or the long-term acute care facility isn't prepared or can't do it. And we have plenty of resources for you to find out what you can do to help your loved one to get off the ventilator. So check out those resources below the video in the written version of this blog, and I put links to those resources where you can find out how you can help your critically ill loved one to get off the ventilator and the tracheostomy. With all this information at your disposal, you are now in a very good position to make an informed decision, get peace of mind, control power and influence, and you are now in a position to stay positive. So, how can you become the best advocate for your critically ill loved one, make informed decisions, get peace of mind, control power and influence quickly whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You get to that all-important feeling of making informed decisions, get peace of mind, control power and influence when you download your free instant impact report now by entering your email below. In your free instant impact report, you learn quickly how to make informed decisions, get peace of mind, real power and real control, and how you can influence decision making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free instant impact report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is even dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free instant impact report now by entering your email below. In your free instant impact report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions, discover the many competing interests in intensive care, and how your critically ill loved one's treatment may depend on those competing interests, how to eliminate fear, frustrations, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 mind-blowing tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to making informed decisions, get peace of mind, control, power and influence in your situation. You will get real-world examples that you can easily adapt to your and your critically ill loved one's situation. How to stop being intimidated by the intensive care team and how you will be seen as equals. You'll get crucial behind-the-scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care, and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered section where I answer your questions, or simply send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions, where you can call me, find international phone numbers on our contacts tab. Also check out our ebook section where you get more ebooks, videos and audio recordings, and where you can also get one-on-one counselling and consulting with me via Skype or over the phone and via email by clicking on the email and phone counselling tabs on the top of the website. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.